Cassoday got going pretty well there in the late 1800s, and the Orient Railroad was supposed to go through there, and I think Bill Trogdon, William Lee Steepmoon has a piece on that in The Prairie Earth, because whoever was it, railroad, his project, the Orient part was to go down into Mexico, and they would sail into China and have this trade route. But I think he went bankrupt or something. The railroad never got built, and it was another quarter century or more before they finally got one there. The Santa Fe built. The Santa Fe had gone through Emporia in 1871 on out farther west. When the railroad did come through Cassoday in 1923, they put up stockyards there, and then just a couple of years, Cassoday became the biggest shipping point on the Santa Fe Railroad. Bazaar was still a big point. Of course, Matfield Green had stockyards. They also had a dipping vat. I don't think the others did. Aikman, Chelsea had, the trains went through there. There were cattle pens at Aikman and a big water tower, but nothing else. This huge big water tower looked like a big black silo. Was built on the highest point between Cottonwood Falls and El Dorado, and you can't tell it's the highest point. It looks pretty smooth and level, but it's slightly downhill both ways, so if a train stopped, steam engine stopped to pick up water, they'd be able to, easier start whichever way they were going. But Cassoday became the big shipping point. Bruce Beheimer, the livestock reporter of the Wichita Stockyards, always called it the cow capital of Kansas. And we became known as kind of a little cow town there, I guess. Cassoday also had a reputation being kind of a wild little place, which I could never understand. I graduated from high school there in 1957, and I could not see anything much wild or exciting about Cassoday, but the reason was when the Santa Fe built the railroad through there, they also built a lake about a mile east of town called Fox Lake, named after the official of the railroad, as Cassoday was named after an official of the railroad. And they also sold lots, or leased lots. People could build cabins, houses, and stay there. A lot of Wichita people, others would have places that stay there. And people still do that. Still, a lot of people live there, come out for weekends. But the Santa Fe also built, or maybe the Lake Association or something, built a clubhouse. And they had dances at the clubhouse, and that's where we got our reputation. Now, back during the 1930s, late teens through the 40s, Prohibition was in effect. And these dances, they'd have dances every Saturday night out at the Fox Lake Club. And it was for the people who lived at the lake, but it was also open to people who lived in the area, the residents of Cassoday. And they would have these big dances and a lot of bootleg whiskey. Cassoday at its peak had over 300 residents. They had a bank. They had, in my memory, 3 grocery stores. The bank went bust during the Depression, but they had 3 grocery stores. They had 3 filling stations, and they had a lumber yard besides the post office, and they had a dry goods store. They had a locker plant. It was really a bustling little community. Today, they're the only place you can get gasoline is north of town, about a quarter of a mile, just off Highway 177. And they also sell beer there, but I don't think it's not a beer joint like, we think of a beer joint. But it was, the dances out of the lake got pretty exciting. And for a population of 300 back there in the 20s and 30s, there were at least a dozen, maybe 15 bootleggers in town, Cassoday residents who one or two manufactured. The rest of them were retailers. They would buy whiskey in bulk somewhere else and then pour it in from the gallon jugs into fifths and pints and half pints, I guess, sell it that way. But that's a pretty good ratio if you consider out of a population of 300 people that probably under half of them, probably a third of them are adult males because they're going to have wives, and then you got kids. So if you got 100 males who would be the customers, and you have 10 or 15 bootleggers, that's pretty much a buyer's market, I think, for the whiskey. Anyway, one of the stories that my father, my uncle told me about the dances was about the time that this young man from Wichita who'd had too much bootleg whiskey jumped up on a table in the middle of the dance and hollers, "I can whip the toughest son of a bitch here." And the band quit playing, the crowd got quiet, people kind of moved away from that table. And here comes Deke Young. There were 4 young brothers, and they were all cowboys. Deke was the oldest. He was the bronc rider of the bunch, and he didn't look very imposing. And he comes kind of bow-legged coming up the table, and the guy, big old kid from Wichita, looks down and says, "Are you the toughest guy here?" And Deke says, "Well, I'll keep you busy till he gets here." And then he reached out and grabbed him by the calf of the leg. And he's so strong, he squeezed that leg so hard, just like you twitch a horse's nose if you're trying to show him he won't stand still. You twitch his nose or his ear, put that pain there, or why a parent will grab his kid's ear to, put a little pressure there to quiet him down. That guy was just, tears went down his cheek. He was frozen. He couldn't move. Fight was over. Now, if he had run out of booze and needed some more, he could have gone to Blackie Caulfield. The Caulfields lived east of Cassoday, southeast. The Caulfield Ranch is out there. And Blackie, they called him Blackie because he dressed in black. All his clothes were black, black hat, black everything. He'd go out, and when he'd come to town to the dances on Saturday night, he'd buy his whiskey in a gallon, by the gallon, but he'd put it into pints and half pints, and as he drove into town, he would toss a bottle out every once in a while. And my dad said, "No, if you ran out, you'd go to Blackie," and he'd get in the car with him and head back toward his ranch, and he'd stop and get out and walk over to a post and kick around a little, and says pretty soon you'd hear that thud of that sole of that boot against that glass. And Dad said it didn't matter if it was a cloudy sky, as dark as anything, he'd always go right to those bottles, yeah. So he was one of the bootleggers, kept things going. In my memory, the only cafe was Opal's Cafe, Opal Green. Her husband was named Holt Green. They lived just about a couple hundred yards east of the railroad tracks on the north side of the road, that Teeterville Road that runs over to Teeterville, past the lake and all that. And my dad said you never found her on one of Opal's meals. It was not a whole lot, but it was good. And it was mainly roast beef, fried chicken, just pretty standard Kansas stuff. Nothing really fancy or not a whole lot of it. But her specialty was a pie. And she made the best pies ever, I think. Well, almost. Real thin crust, and she all kinds of flavors: cherry and raisin, cream, chocolate, lemon, coconut, all that. And on shipping day, and of course, cattle would arrive here at Cassoday in the spring, in mid-April. Now, earlier on, they arrived at Burns, they arrived at DeGraff, and they'd drive them into here and on east of here, southeast, northeast, and all around the area to deliver these cattle from DeGraff or from Burns. But then when they opened up the stockyards here, they just didn't have quite so far to drive them. When you shipped them, they used to have to ship cattle out of DeGraff or Burns or Bazaar. My grandfather would drive cattle from our place, mile and a half northwest of Cassoday, to DeGraff. I suppose it's 18 miles or so over there to do it. But in my memory, it was always stockyards here. My father and uncle would have been, the railroad opened in 23, they'd have been 19 and 16 when that opened. So I'm sure they drove cattle to these faraway places too early on. But if you were shipping cattle, you would call Opal the day or two before you were ready to ship and tell them how big your crew was. And every rancher in the area, every pasture man around would call her and tell her. And there might be 3, 4, 5 different outfits shipping that day. They might have 5 to 10 people helping with them, but there might be 50, 75 people to eat there at the cafe. And it wasn't big. There were maybe 8 or 10 stools and maybe 2 or 3 or 4 little tables on one side. There was a washroom, no indoor restroom. There was one out back, but nothing indoors, but a little small washroom back there. But she could feed those 50 or 75 people. For one thing, the cattle never arrived at the stockyards at the same time. Those who were shipping from closer, you'd get there earlier. Some of the people we helped we'd drive cattle maybe 15, 17 miles. Other times, helping somebody around here, you might just drive them 2 or 3 miles. So you'd get in the yards early and you'd go down to Opal's and eat. We might not get in till 1, and then would weigh the cattle, then we'd go down and eat. But she'd, if you was full, you'd just sit out on the porch. There's a couple trees out east of the cafe, visit a while. And then when it emptied out some, you'd go in and eat. And I don't ever remember a printed menu. She might have had a couple or 3 choices, but that was it. Where you did have a choice with the pie, and the pie was excellent. Really thin crust. And I think it's, cherry cream pie. Cherries are kind of acidic. And you try to, my wife used to try to make cherry cream pie for me. It was never the same as Opal's because those cherries turn that vanilla filling, you make it kind of runny. Hers didn't do that. I don't know why. I don't know what she did. Or maybe I just don't remember it. But anyway, that was one of my favorites, that cherry cream pie. And I'm sure there was never a piece of pie left over at the end of the day because it was very, very popular. Anyway, you'd eat and wait for the train to come in. Train come from the south. They'd load up at Aikman, they'd load here, and then they'd go to Matfield, go to Bazaar, and then on to Kansas City. And when you finish eating, if the train wasn't here yet, you'd go out and sit on the porch, sit under a tree, visit a while more until you heard that whistle and heard that train slowing down. And then you would head to the stockyards. It's about a quarter mile, I guess, and start loading cattle. Those cattle came in the spring, and they were almost all from Texas back then. Today they come from everywhere. I have helped a rancher here several years ago. My son worked for him at the time, who was pasturing Florida cattle that came from Florida. But cattle often come from Kentucky, from Missouri, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, other parts of Kansas. But I think the majority of these summer cattle still come from Texas, a lot of them from old Mexico. But they'd come about 45 in a railroad stock car. When you shipped them in the summer, you'd get 25. They'd gotten that much bigger, gained that much weight. But those were the kind of the days of excitement in town when the cattle shipping is going on. The trains quit shipping cattle in the mid to late 60s. I guess the business was either kind of bothersome to them, not so profitable. They sort of discouraged it, actually. But about the same time, well, after World War II, they started using trucks, mainly to haul them from here, maybe to Kansas City or Omaha or something. But they began to use trucks more heavily in the later 1950s and in the 1960s. And by the late 60s, by 1970, I don't think you could load a steer on a train in Kansas. And by 75, I don't think you could load a cow on a train anywhere in the United States. Trucks had taken over entirely. And about that same time, around the 1970, a little bit earlier maybe, they began double stocking. That is, they began to, well, another big change. About the same time, all these big changes around 1970, a little before, a little bit after. The cattle in the earlier years were aged steers, transient cattle raised somewhere else, brought here just for the grazing season, which ran from mid-April to mid-October, and then taken on somewhere else to market. So transient cattle raised somewhere else, brought here for the summer, then sent on. And they were actually, when they bought paid the freight on them, they paid the freight from here to Kansas City, or from here to, from Texas to Kansas City, or Texas to Omaha. But it was, they'd take them here, unload them, then load them back up later to finish the ride. So it was kind of interesting how they'd do that. They'd have that break in the middle. The Texas steers, as I said, were older, bigger, and they'd gain a lot of weight in the summer. They'd all come around the middle of April and be driven from the stockyards here out to the pastures, wherever. And then when you got ready to ship the fat ones, you'd start in mid to late July. Now, say you took 500 steers to this pasture out in Flint Hills. It's 2,000 acre pasture, because you give those steers 4 acres. Those aged steers 4 acres. 500 of them, yeah, that's 2,000 acres. And they'd put on that grass about mid-April. Along about the latter part of July, late July, you'd go out there and you'd round up all 500 steers. And either the man that was pasturing the cattle, the pasture man, the Kansas rancher that is, or maybe the Texas rancher would have sent his foreman up, or maybe the commission man in Kansas City, his name was Olin Weaver, he might come down, and they would cut out just the fattest ones. And they'd cut out so many carloads. Say they wanted 100 head on this day. So they'd come down, they'd cut out 100 head that'd fill 4 stock cars. Those 100 head would have come in on a little over 2 cars. They'd leave on 4. And then you'd drive those 100 head from the pasture. The guy we helped a lot, it might be 15 miles, 16 miles here into the stockyards. And then you'd weigh them right away, put them in a pen, holding pen, then bring them up 25 at a time. The older cowboys would, the younger guys would handle the bull board, a big old heavy thing you put between that gap between the railroad car and the loading dock, and the big old heavy gates you'd swing around to form a solid chute, which had a slide. You could slide them, because if the train didn't stop straight on, the gates wouldn't quite reach, and you'd have to extend them. They didn't extend easily. They kept them greased. They still didn't extend easily. And then maybe he's back here again. You have to shove them back in. And that leads to an interesting story. Remind me where I was here. But anyway, one time, and this guy lived out on the Henley Ranch east of Cassoday. He's helping ship, and they got here, I suppose, about 2 in the afternoon, something like that. They usually ship around, the train usually get here 3, 4, 5 at the latest. And it wasn't here at 5. So they go down to the depot to talk to the station agent. What's wrong with the train? Where is he? Well, he's coming, but they've had some trouble down the line. He's going to be late. It doesn't get there till like 10:30 at night. Well, this is no daylight savings time. It's plenty dark. But there's, of course, there's electric lights in the stockyards. But there's a bunch of cattle to load. This outfit was the last ones in. The others might wait. Some of the other people there might wait to help them load, but they didn't have to. And so they're loading the cattle. It's going to take a little while, probably an hour or so, to get these cattle all loaded that are in the pens, because there are 4 or 5 outfits shipping. But every time the train stops, it's here, and then it's back here, and then it's here, and then it's here. So they're having to pull that gate, and this guy is helping on the dock, loading dock, and he's having to lug that, and that bullboard weighs, I suppose, a couple 100 pounds or more. There's a ring on each side. 2 of them have to grab it. They have from here back over to here, 6, 8 feet, and then have to shove those gates in or pull them back out. And it's just taking forever. It's after midnight, and they're just getting to their cattle. This guy's got a ride. There's no trucks or trailers. This is the 1930s, early 40s. He's got a ride at least 12 miles back to his house when it's all over, and he's got to get up at probably 4 o'clock the next morning to ship again. He won't get home till 2:30 or 3, you know. And he says to the brakeman, he says, "What in the hell's wrong with that engineer? Doesn't he know how to drive this train?" And the brakeman just kind of shrugs. He's not too happy either. He'd rather be home and asleep, you know. And the cowboy says, "Well, maybe it's you. Maybe you don't know how to signal him with that lantern." And the brakeman says, "If you're so damn smart, what, you want to do the signaling?" And the cowboy says, "You smart, like somebody ought to teach you some manners." And the brakeman says, "Come right ahead." And the cowboy lunges at him, and he hits him in the side of the head with the lantern, knocks him down, sitting on him, pounding away. The other cowboys come running up to see what's happening. And the guy the cowboy on the floor, on the ground, being hit, never landed a blow, but he yells up at the other guys, "Get me away from this guy before I hurt him." And the fight's over. And after that, every time the train stopped, no matter where it was, the brakeman would say, "How's that?" And the cowboy would say, "Close enough." Now, that is supposedly a true story. I don't know if it is or not, but I like the story. Around Cassoday, there's quite a bit of farmland. Around Matfield Green, there's quite a bit of farmland. But you get out and away from town, it's too rocky to farm. So the bottomlands, I mean, here along the Walnut here in El Dorado, you got good farmland. But get out east of town here toward Rosalia and the hills, those rocks don't plow up very easily, don't plant very easily. So you have farmland in the bottom, pasture land in the upper land. A lot of the pioneers that came in, homesteaders, they'd try to farm, and you couldn't really grow much crop on top of one of these hills. So they began to farm the bottomlands and then pasture the uplands. And that's a pattern in the Flint Hills. In the musical Oklahoma, there's that song, "The Farmer and the Cowboy Can Be Friends." In the Flint Hills, the farmer and the cowboy can be the same man, and often are, equally adept at riding a horse or driving a tractor, because he's got a couple 100 acres of farmland, and then he's got a couple 1,000 acres of pasture land. Yeah. Wind power is okay, but why would you want to ruin the last significant stand of tall grass prairie, not in Kansas, not just in America, North America, in the world? The 5 million acres of native grass in the Flint Hills of Kansas, the 1 million acres, the southern Flint Hills, what the Okies call the Osage Hills, those 6 million acres of native grass, as the largest single contiguous stand of tall grass prairie anywhere in the world. Because tall grass prairie requires 30 to 40 inches of rain a year to be tallgrass prairie. That much rain supports crop agriculture. I've been to Argentina a couple times. Drive out into the Pampas. The Pampas, Humido, or where they farm. You've never seen so much soybean and corn and wheat as down there in Argentina. You get into Pampas Seco, the dry part of the Pampas, it's wide open country because there's not enough rain there to support agriculture. And that's why this tallgrass prairie is 170 million acres of tallgrass prairie. From Canada, into Canada, down into Texas, from central Kansas to Indiana, all tallgrass prairie. You go to Iowa, Illinois now, what tallgrass do you have? Corn and milo. If you can find 10 acres of native grass in one of the states, it's a state park, yeah, or a roadside. But here, people in Kansas, in the Flint Hills, don't appreciate what we have because it doesn't grab your eye. I remember years ago, a newspaper editor, I think he's from Detroit, drove the turnpike and talked about the barren, godforsaken country he had to drive through between El Dorado and Emporia. The editor of the Emporia Gazette, Ray Call, took offense and said, well, and so, this is really great country. It's, and they had this little newspaper editorial war between, the slums of Detroit and the wide open spaces of the Flint Hills and stuff. But the people don't see it. I forget the name of the novel, but the guy travels through this area out to Colorado, and he talks about in Newton, or they're north of Newton. He leaves from there, I think, and he talks about the country east of there that would blight the eyes of a buzzard. He's talking about the Flint Hills. People just don't see anything. Why? There are no mountains. There are no huge canyons. So there's no towering pine forest. All they see is grass. Larry McMurtry, the guy that wrote Lonesome Dove, didn't know about the Flint Hills. He wrote a book called Roads, travels on, through the main highways of America or something like that. And when he drives from Cassoday to Emporia on the Flint Hills, he is awestruck. He says he didn't know there was that much prairie land left, rangeland left that hadn't been disfigured by oil wells or farm plowed up or stuff like that. That's why I don't want them disfigured by wind generators. This is the last true tallgrass prairie, and it's beautiful if you know what to look for. Wayne Rogler, I cowboyed for him when I was worked on his ranch before I started teaching. He said, your heart rate is guaranteed to slow down if you're out in the middle of a Flint Hills pasture. It's calming. It's a calming beauty. The expression I use is the Flint Hills don't take your breath away. They give you a chance to catch it. It's wonderful country. And yeah, I feel real blessed to be a Flint Hills native.